Somewhere in the northern reaches of the Black Hills, in the land that is now called South Dakota, there is a narrow valley where the trees once stood pale and bare against the darker green of the slopes around them. Fire had passed through in some earlier year, leaving the trunks stripped and lifeless, and when the first prospectors made their way up the gulch, they looked at those dead dines and gave the place a name so plain it has outlasted everything else about it. They called it Deadwood. It is a quiet name, almost a gentle one, and yet it became attached to one of the most famous and most misunderstood towns in the history of the American West. Tonight, we are going to walk slowly through that story together, in no hurry at all, letting the years unfold at the pace of footsteps on a muddy street. We will move from the wooded hills as they were long before any gold was found, through the strange and sudden birth of a town that was never supposed to exist, past the gamblers and the merchants and the immigrants and the miners who filled it, and on toward the questions that still linger over the place. And there is one question in particular that will follow us the whole way, like the sound of a distant bell. Deadwood has long been remembered as the most lawless town in America. But was it? Or did a single extraordinary handful of years become magnified, retold, and reshaped until the legend grew far larger than the place itself? Before we go any further into the hills, I would love to hear from you. If you could sit beside a fire and listen to the story of any figure, any city, any empire, or any unsolved mystery from the past, what would you choose? Leave your idea in the comments below, because the suggestions people share genuinely shape the journeys we take next. This is still a very new and very small channel, quietly finding its way, and every single person who subscribes makes a real difference in helping it grow. If you enjoy calm, immersive history told slowly and gently, made for relaxing and drifting off to sleep, a quiet like on this video helps more than you might imagine. And now, with the fire lit and the night settling in, let us go back to the hills as they were before the world came rushing in. Long before there were saloons or stagecoaches, before the first hammer struck the first nail in Deadwood Gulch, the Black Hills rose from the surrounding grasslands like an island of forest in a sea of open plain. Seen from a distance across many miles of rolling prairie, the hills appear as a low, dark mass on the horizon, their slopes so thick with ponderosa pine that from far away they seem almost black. That darkness gave them their name in more than one language. To the Lakota people, for whom this land held a meaning far deeper than scenery, the hills were known as Paha Sapa, the hills that are black. They were not simply a place to pass through. They were understood as a sacred center, a place of origin and renewal, wrapped in stories and ceremonies carried across generations. Imagine standing at the edge of that forest in the years before the rush, where the last of the grassland gives way to the first of the pines. Streams run clear and cold down through the narrow valleys, threading between granite outcrops and stands of spruce. In the high country, the air is cooler, scented with resin and damp earth, and the sound is not of machinery or crowds, but of wind moving through the branches and water sliding over stone. Herds of game moved through these valleys, and people moved with them, and the hills served as shelter, as hunting ground, and as a spiritual heartland all at once. It is important, before the story of the town begins, to hold this image firmly in mind, because so much of the Deadwood legend begins as though the hills were empty, waiting, and unclaimed. They were none of those things.
To the Lakota, and to other peoples of the northern plains before them, these hills were not merely useful ground, but the very centre of the world, a place woven into the deepest stories of who they were and where they had come from. In some of their traditions, the hills and the caves within them are bound up with the origins of the people themselves, with narratives of emergence into the light of this world, so that to walk among them was to walk in a sacred landscape thick with meaning. The hills were a place to gather certain plants and poles, to seek visions in solitude on the high places, to hold ceremonies, and to shelter through the harder seasons when the open plains grew cruel. The people did not live crowded together in the hills year-round, for their lives followed the great herds across the wider grasslands, but they returned to this high wooded island again and again, and they understood it as belonging to them in a way that ran far deeper than any deed or treaty could capture. Ownership, in the sense the newcomers would soon assert, was almost too small a word for the bond between the Lakota and Pahasapa. It was closer to the bond between a people and their church, their ancestors, and their source. All of this was already old, already settled, already sacred, long before the first prospector ever dipped a pan into a Black Hills stream. Whatever else the story of Deadwood is, it is not the story of an empty land discovered. It is the story of a claimed and cherished land taken.
By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was pressing westward across the Great Plains with enormous momentum. Wagon trains, railroads, soldiers, settlers, and surveyors were reshaping the map year by year, and the northern plains had become a place of repeated friction between the growing nation and the peoples who already lived there. To manage that friction, at least on paper, the government turned to treaties. In the spring of 1868, at Fort Laramie, in what is now Wyoming, representatives of the United States and leaders of the Lakota and their allies put their names and their marks to an agreement that would echo through the next century and a half.
The Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in April of 1868, established what was called the Great Sioux Reservation, an enormous area west of the Missouri River, and it recognized the Black Hills as belonging to that reservation, set apart for the exclusive use of the Lakota people. The language of the treaty was unusually clear. The land was to be held for their absolute and undisturbed use and occupation. White settlement there was to be prohibited. And crucially, the treaty stated that no future agreement to give up any part of this land would be valid unless it was signed by at least 3 out of every 4 adult men of the tribes. That single provision, 3/4 of the adult men, would become one of the most important lines ever written into an American treaty, though almost no one signing it that spring could have known why.
So the legal situation, as the town of Deadwood was about to come into being, was not ambiguous at all. The Black Hills were treaty land, They belonged, by the United States government's own solemn agreement, to the Lakota. White settlement there was not merely discouraged, it was forbidden by the law of the nation that would later claim the town as one of its proudest frontier legends. To understand Deadwood, you have to begin with this quiet contradiction, sitting at the very root of everything that followed. The situation might have remained tense but manageable for many years, and then came word of something buried beneath those dark and wooded hills: gold.
The rumor of gold in the Black Hills was older than any expedition. For years there had been whispers, carried by trappers and traders, and the occasional prospector who slipped into the hills and slipped out again, that the streams there ran over flecks of yellow metal. But rumor is a fragile thing, and the hills were closed by treaty, and so the whispers remained only whispers until the summer of 1874. When the United States Army sent a large expedition into the heart of that forbidden country. The man at the head of that column was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer.
The stated purpose of the expedition was practical and, on its surface, unrelated to gold. Custer's orders were to explore the little mapped interior of the hills, to find a suitable location for a future military post, and to identify a route through the region towards the southwest. He set out from Fort Abraham Lincoln, near present-day Bismarck, in early July of 1874, with roughly 1,000 men of the 7th Cavalry, more than 100 wagons, and a long tail of scouts, teamsters, engineers, and cattle for food. He also brought geologists, and in a detail that reveals a great deal about the man, a full brass band mounted on white horses, along with newspaper correspondents whose reports would soon carry news of the expedition to readers across the country. Whatever the official mission, Custer understood the value of a story, and quietly among the column rode practical miners whose only interest was the streams.
The column wound its way into the hills, and near the end of July made camp along a stream that would later be called French Creek, near the site of the present-day town of Custer. There, the miners who had come along began to pan the gravel of the creek bed, and on the first days of August they found what they were looking for. Two prospectors, generally named as Horatio Ross and William Mackay, recovered enough fine gold from the soil to convince the assayers travelling with the expedition that a determined miner might earn as much as $150 a day. By the standards of the 1870s, that was an astonishing figure. Custer entrusted dispatches to a scout who carried them south towards Fort Laramie, and within weeks the words "Gold in the Black Hills" were printed and reprinted in newspapers from the plains to the eastern seaboard.
There is a human detail in that expedition worth carrying with you, because it complicates the simple picture of a column of soldiers marching into empty country. As the men advanced into the hills, Custer, ever mindful of spectacle, travelled with a full brass band mounted on white horses, its music drifting strangely through the pines, and with newspaper correspondents whose dispatches were meant from the outset to reach a national audience. The expedition was, in part, a performance, staged as much for the readers back east as for any military purpose. And among the party was a woman, an African-American cook named Sarah Campbell, known to the men as Aunt Sally, who by many accounts had been born into slavery. When the miners staked their claims along the creek, she staked one of their own, becoming a recorded claim holder in her own right, and she is remembered as the first non-indigenous woman known to have entered the Black Hills. She would come back to the hills in later years and live out much of her life there.
That a woman born into bondage should be among the very first to follow the gold into that forbidden country is exactly the kind of detail the legends leave out. And it is a quiet reminder at the very beginning of the story that the real West was always more various and more surprising than the myth that grew up over it.
It is worth pausing here to understand how little certainty a gold rush actually required. Historians have long debated whether the amount of gold found on French Creek in 1874 was genuinely significant or merely a handful of promising flakes. Some accounts speak of real and encouraging deposits. Others suggest the discovery was modest, even marginal, and that its importance lay entirely in how it was reported rather than in what was found. For the men who would soon pour into the hills, the distinction hardly mattered. The country was still recovering from the financial panic of 1873. Many thousands of people were out of work, uncertain of their futures, and hungry for any chance to begin again. Into that anxious moment fell the news of gold in a distant range of hills, and the effect was electric. Rumour did not need to be true to be powerful. It only needed to be believed. And so the miners came. They came despite the fact that the hills were treaty land, despite the fact that the government had pledged to keep white settlers out, and despite the fact that the army was, in theory, obligated to turn them back. At first the authorities did try. Soldiers were sent to intercept the earliest waves of prospectors, and some were escorted out of the hills. But the pressure of thousands of determined people, each imagining a fortune waiting in a streambed, proved impossible to hold back for long. The federal government found itself caught in a contradiction it could not resolve. It had promised to protect the land for the Lakota, and yet it could not or would not stop its own citizens from streaming across the boundary. This was not simply the birth of a rough frontier town. It was the beginning of a slow collapse of a solemn national agreement, and everything that Deadwood would become grew out of that collapse.
By 1875, the trickle had become a flood, and prospectors were pushing deeper into the hills, following the streams northward in search of richer ground. The southern discovery near French Creek had drawn the first wave, but the hills are large, and the most patient searchers kept moving, panning creek after creek, watching always for the telltale glint in the gravel. Late in that year and into the following one, miners working their way into the northern hills came upon a gulch where the water ran over promising ground and the trees stood dead along the slopes. It was here, in the deep and narrow valley of Deadwood Gulch, that the story of the town truly begins.
The year was 1876. A year that would carry a strange double weight in American memory, marking both the centennial of the nation's founding and the height of the conflict over these very hills. In the early months of that year, the first serious mining camps took shape along the creek, and word of rich placer deposits, loose gold that could be washed straight from the gravel, drew men up the gulch by the hundreds and then by the thousands. What happened next was one of the fastest transformations of empty ground into crowded settlement anywhere in the history of the West. Picture the gulch in those first months. The valley floor is narrow, hemmed in by steep wooded slopes, so that the town cannot spread out in the usual way, but must instead stretch itself thin along the creek, a single crowded ribbon of activity following the water.
At first there are only tents, pale canvas shapes scattered among the stumps, and rough shelters dug into the clay banks, and lean-tos of peeled logs. But almost as quickly as men arrive, buildings begin to rise. The sound of the place is the sound of construction that never quite stops. Hammering, the rasp of saws biting into green pine, the creak and groan of ox teams hauling wagons piled high with lumber and flour and tools and whiskey. Smoke rises from cooking fires and from the chimneys of hastily built cabins. The ground underfoot, churned by boots and hooves and wheels, is very often deep mud.
The people who filled this place were as varied as the goods in the wagons. There were miners, of course, thousands of them, many with little more than a pan, a shovel, and a stubborn hope. But there were also merchants who had quickly grasped a simple truth of every gold rush, that the surest fortunes were often made not by digging for gold, but by selling things to the men who did. Flour, bacon, boots, picks, canvas, nails, and whiskey could all be sold at prices inflated by the remoteness of the camp, and the shopkeeper who arrived early with a full wagon might end the year far richer than the prospector shivering in the creek. So alongside the miners came storekeepers and bakers and blacksmiths, freighters and bartenders and carpenters, gamblers and cooks and laundry workers, and the whole restless population of a boomtown improvising itself into being.
The people who poured into the gulch came from an extraordinary range of places, far wider than the familiar image of the West would ever suggest. There were Americans from every part of the country, Easterners and Southerners and Midwesterners, some fleeing the hard times that had followed the financial panic, some simply restless and hungry for a fresh start. But there were also immigrants drawn from across the world by the universal magnet of gold. Experienced hard rock miners came from Cornwall in the west of England, so skilled underground that the Cornishman became a familiar and valued figure in American mining camps everywhere. There were Irish and Germans and Scandinavians and Italians and men from many corners of Europe, each bringing their own languages and customs and cooking to the crowded street. There were Jewish merchants, some of whom became among the most respected and successful businessmen in the town, building enterprises that would long outlast the gold. There were African Americans, like Aunt Sally, who had come with the very first expedition, seeking in the West a measure of freedom and opportunity too often denied them elsewhere. And there was, as we shall soon see in greater depth, a substantial Chinese community that made its own distinct home at the northern end of the street. If you had stood on the main street on a busy afternoon and simply closed your eyes to listen, you would have heard a remarkable mingling of tongues and accents, the sound of a town assembled almost overnight from the far corners of the earth. This was the real frontier, not a narrow world of lone American gunmen, but a churning, many-peopled gathering of humanity, thrown together by the promise of gold into one crowded valley in the hills.
Estimates of just how many people crowded into Deadwood and the surrounding gulches during 1876 vary widely, and this is a point where honesty requires us to admit uncertainty. Some contemporary accounts speak of 5,000 people gathering within months. Others suggest that when you count all the camps strung along the creeks, the number swelled towards 10,000, and a few of the more dramatic later estimates reach as high as 25,000 at the peak. The truth is that no one was keeping careful count. People arrived and departed constantly. The population shifted with the seasons and with each new rumour of a richer strike elsewhere, and the boundaries of what counted as Deadwood itself were blurred among a cluster of neighbouring settlements. What we can say with confidence is that a great many people, most of them men, poured into a very small valley in a very short time, faster than any ordinary system of government could hope to keep pace with.
And that brings us to the heart of the puzzle. How does a community make rules when the community itself, by the law of the land, is not supposed to exist at all? Deadwood sat on treaty ground. There was no lawful town charter to inherit, no established county, no courthouse, no sheriff riding in with the authority of the territory behind him. In the strictest legal sense, every person in the gulch was a trespasser. And yet the answer to that puzzle was not, as the legend would later insist, complete and howling anarchy. Something far more interesting happened. Deadwood began almost from its first weeks to invent its own fragile institutions of order.
To understand what lawless truly meant in a place like Deadwood, we have to set aside the image handed down by a century of films and imagine instead the practical problems that faced ordinary people trying to live and work in the gulch. Two men both claimed the same stretch of creek. A debt went unpaid. A theft was discovered. Someone was killed. In a settled town, such matters flowed towards courts and officials whose authority everyone recognized. In Deadwood, in 1876, no such recognized authority existed. And so, as frontier communities across the West had done before them, the people of the Gulch built their own.
The most important of these improvised institutions was the miners' meeting, sometimes called the miners' court. When prospectors first crowded into a new district, they would gather and agree among themselves on the rules by which mining claims would be measured, recorded, and respected. How many feet of creek could one man hold? How a claim was to be marked? How long it could be left unworked before another could take it? These were not laws handed down from above, but agreements made among the men themselves, written into a claim book and enforced by the pressure of the whole community. It was rough, and it favoured those already present over newcomers, and it could be twisted by the powerful. But it was a system, and it worked well enough that a man could, in most cases, dig with some confidence that the ground beneath him would still be his tomorrow. For disputes and crimes, the same principle applied. When something serious happened, the community would convene, appoint someone to act as judge, choose others to argue each side, and gather a jury from among the men present. There was no statute book to consult, no higher court to appeal to, only the shared sense of the gathered crowd about what was fair. Punishment might be a fine, or banishment from the camp, or in the gravest cases, something far heavier. It was a form of justice that depended entirely on the willingness of the community to accept its own verdicts, and it carried real dangers. A crowd can be swayed by a good speaker or a popular defendant. Passions could run high. And a court with no lawful standing could hand down a decision that would not and could not hold up once real government finally arrived. That last problem, the hollowness of a court with no true authority, was about to be tested in the most famous way imaginable.
Because even as Deadwood was inventing its fragile order, it was drawing to itself men and women whose names had already travelled far across the frontier, carried by newspapers and cheap novels and campfire talk. The gold rush pulled in not only the anonymous thousands, but a scattering of people who were, in the language of the day, already famous. And in the summer of 1876, one of the most famous of them all rode up the gulch and into the town that would forever bind itself to his name. He was a tall man with long hair and a careful eye, and the country already knew him as Wild Bill. His given name was James Butler Hickok, and he had been born in Illinois in the 1830s, far from the western plains he would come to symbolize. Before Deadwood, before the legend hardened around him, he had lived a life that touched many of the currents of his turbulent era. He had worked as a stagecoach driver and a lawman, served as a scout and a spy during the Civil War, and drifted through the cattle towns of Kansas, where he wore a badge for a time in places like Hays City and Abilene. He was a gambler by habit and inclination, drawn to the poker tables the way some men are drawn to the sea. And he had been involved in shootings that were real enough to leave men dead and dramatic enough to be told and retold until it became difficult to separate the man from the tale. That difficulty is the essential thing to understand about Hickok. By the time he reached Deadwood, he was already as much a story as a person. His reputation had been built partly on genuine events, for he truly had killed men in confrontations, and partly on the eager exaggerations of newspaper writers and the authors of dime novels, cheap and thrilling paperbacks that fed the Eastern public's hunger for tales of the wild frontier. One widely read magazine article in the late 1860s had already inflated his exploits into something close to myth, crediting him with a nearly impossible number of killings and casting him as a knight of the plains. Hickok seems to have had a complicated relationship with his own fame, sometimes playing to it and sometimes weary of it. What is clear is that the Wild Bill who arrived in the Black Hills in 1876 was a man walking inside a legend that had partly been written for him by others. There is also a quieter and more human thread to his final chapter. By the time he came to Deadwood, Hickok was no longer a young man, and there are persistent accounts, difficult to confirm with certainty, that his eyesight had begun to fail him. Some historians take these reports seriously, suggesting that the famous marksman may have been troubled by a worsening condition of the eyes. Others treat the claim more cautiously, noting how easily such details attach themselves to a legend. He had also, only months before, married Agnes Lake, a widow and former circus performer, and by most accounts his journey to the Black Hills was undertaken in the hope of finding enough gold to build a settled life with her. Whether he came to the hills as a gunfighter, a gambler, or simply a middle-aged man hoping for one more chance at fortune, is a question that the evidence does not fully answer. Most likely, he came as all three at once. He travelled to Deadwood in the company of an old friend, Charlie Utter, sometimes called Colorado Charlie, whose wagon train made its way into the hills in the summer of 1876. Riding in that same company was another figure whose name would become entwined with his, a young woman already known as Calamity Jane, though we will come to her in her own time. When Hickok arrived in the crowded gulch, he did not set about mining. He settled into the life he knew best, taking his place at the poker tables of the town's saloons, and it was there, rather than in any gunfight, that his story in Deadwood would reach its end. He would spend only a few short weeks in the town, and yet those few weeks would tie his name to Deadwood forever. The end came on the 2nd of August, 1876, inside a saloon owned by two men named Nuttall and Mann, a place later remembered simply as Number 10. To understand what happened, we should slow down and reconstruct it as carefully as the surviving evidence allows, because this single event has been retold so many times that the retellings have nearly buried the facts. The day before, Hickok had been playing poker with several men, and among them was a drifter recently arrived in town, a young man named John McCall, remembered by the crooked shape of his nose. McCall had played badly and lost heavily until he had nothing left. According to the most commonly repeated accounts, Hickok, in a gesture that was either kindness or a subtle insult depending on how one reads it, gave McCall some money to buy a meal and advised him not to play again until he could cover his losses. McCall took the money, but whatever he felt beneath his silence, some accounts say wounded pride, others say a simmering resentment, he did not forget it.
The following afternoon, Hickok returned to the saloon to play again. Here we come to a detail that has become central to the legend, and that appears consistently enough in the accounts to be treated as probable. Hickok had a well-known habit of sitting with his back to a wall so that he could see the room and the door, a caution born of a life in which enemies were real. But on this day his usual seat was taken. Another player, often named as Charlie Rich, occupied the chair against the wall, and though Hickok is said to have asked more than once to change places, he was refused or waved off, and at last he sat down with his back exposed to the room and to the door behind him. It was, as later tellers of the story never fail to note, a fatal exception to the habit of a lifetime. McCall entered the saloon. He moved through the room, came up behind the seated Hickok, drew a revolver, and by most accounts shouted a few words before firing a single shot into the back of Hickok's head. The famous gunfighter died instantly, slumping forward, and the bullet, having passed through, is said to have struck another player at the table in the wrist. There was no duel, no warning, no fair fight of the kind the legends love. There was only a drunken young man, a drawn pistol, and a man shot from behind while holding a hand of cards.
And what of those cards? This is where legend and fact braid together most tightly. The hand that Hickok is said to have been holding when he died, 2 black aces and 2 black eights, has become one of the most famous images in the folklore of the West, known ever after as the dead man's hand. Gamblers around the world still speak of it, but here we must be careful, because the historical record is far less certain than the legend suggests. Contemporary reports of the shooting do not agree on precisely what cards Hickok held, and the specific combination of aces and eights seems to have become fixed in popular memory only in later decades, long after the event, popularized by writers looking back on the killing. The 5th card, if there was one, is a matter of pure speculation, filled in differently by different tellers. So while the dead man's hand is a genuine piece of Western folklore, we should hold it gently, as a legend that grew up around a real death, rather than as a documented fact. The truth of that afternoon is simpler and sadder. A man was murdered at a card table, and the exact cards mattered far less at the time than they would come to matter afterward.
McCall's motive is nearly as uncertain as the cards. In the immediate aftermath, and at the hasty trial that followed, he claimed that he had killed Hickok in revenge, saying that Wild Bill had earlier killed his brother in Kansas. but no reliable evidence has ever confirmed that such a brother existed, or that any such killing took place, and many historians regard the story as an invention offered up to justify the act. Other explanations have been suggested over the years. Perhaps it was the humiliation of the previous day's poker game. Perhaps McCall hoped that by killing so famous a man, he might make a name for himself, trading on Hickok's fame the way so many others had. Perhaps he was simply a reckless and resentful young man, drunk and armed in a lawless camp. We cannot know for certain what moved him. What we can trace with unusual clarity is the extraordinary legal tangle his crime produced, and it is that tangle, more than the shooting itself, that reveals the deepest truth about Deadwood. Because when McCall was seized by the crowd shortly after the killing, the town faced a problem it was not equipped to solve. Deadwood had no lawful court, no recognized judge, no legal authority of any kind, for it sat on treaty land where the government of the territory did not yet reach. And yet a famous man had been murdered in front of witnesses, and something had to be done. So the townspeople did what frontier communities did. They convened a miners' court, an improvised tribunal assembled in a theatre in the camp. They appointed a judge, a prosecutor, and a defender, and they impaneled a jury from among the men of the town. It had the shape and the ceremony of a trial. What it did not have was any legal standing whatsoever.
McCall told the jury his story of a murdered brother and a righteous revenge. Whether they believed him or whether other pressures were at work, the outcome astonished many who witnessed it. The miners' court acquitted him. The man who had shot Wild Bill Hickok in the back of the head before witnesses in a crowded saloon walked free. He left the camp soon afterward, and for a time it seemed he had escaped entirely.
But the very lawlessness that had allowed the improvised court to exist also rendered its verdict meaningless. Because Deadwood's court had no legal authority, its acquittal had no legal weight, and that opened a door that would ordinarily be closed. In the American legal tradition, a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime, a protection against double jeopardy. But that protection applies only to a valid trial before a court of proper jurisdiction. The Deadwood Miners' Court had been no such thing. In the eyes of the law, McCall had never truly been tried at all. So when he drifted into the Wyoming Territory and could not keep himself from boasting about how he had killed the famous Wild Bill, and word of his bragging reached the ears of a federal marshal, he was arrested and brought to answer for the crime a second time. This time before a lawful court in Yankton, the capital of the Dakota Territory.
There, in a proper courtroom with real jurisdiction, the story of the murdered brother collapsed under scrutiny. McCall was tried, convicted of murder, and sentenced to death. In the early spring of 1877, he was hanged. And so the strange arc of the case came to a close. One killing answered by two trials. The first a hollow ceremony in a lawless camp, and the second a genuine reckoning under the authority of the nation. In that contrast lies the whole question of Deadwood in miniature. The town could hold a trial. It could not, at first, hold a lawful one. It had the forms of order without the substance of it, and it would take the arrival of real government to close the gap.
Hickok was buried in the hills above the town, and his grave would in time become one of the most visited in the West, drawing travelers who wished to stand beside the resting place of a legend. But the man beneath the wooden marker had lived in Deadwood only a few weeks, and his death, however famous, tells us relatively little about the daily texture of the town. For that, we must turn away from the celebrated gunfighter and toward the far larger number of people whose names history never bothered to record. Because Deadwood was not, in truth, a town of gunfighters. It was a town of miners, merchants, cooks, labourers, entertainers, immigrants, and families, and it is in their ordinary lives that the real place comes into focus. Consider what it actually meant to live in Deadwood Gulch in those first years. The valley was narrow and crowded, the buildings pressed close together along the creek, and the business of daily survival was constant and demanding. Food had to be hauled in over long and difficult roads, and so it was expensive, sometimes dizzyingly so. A sack of flour, a pound of bacon, a few eggs, all of these might cost many times what they would in a settled town back east, because everything had to travel by wagon across hundreds of miles of open country before it reached the gulch. Fresh vegetables were a luxury. Preserved and salted goods were the staple. A miner who spent his days bent over a rocker in the cold water of the creek came home to plain and costly fare, and the merchants who supplied it grew steadily richer, while the diggers gambled on the hope of a strike.
Shelter, too, was rough and improvised. In the earliest days, many people lived in tents or in cabins thrown together from unseasoned logs, their gaps stuffed with mud and cloth against the wind. As the town matured, frame buildings rose along the main street, but comfort was scarce and privacy scarcer. The gulch offered little level ground, so buildings crowded onto every available foot. And in the wet seasons, the single main street became a river of mud that could pull the boots from a man's feet and mire a loaded wagon to its axles. Sanitation was primitive. Waste and refuse were a constant problem, and the creek that had drawn everyone to the valley in search of gold also served, unfortunately, as a channel for the town's filth. The consequences of that arrangement would prove far deadlier than any gunfighter.
Water carried disease, and disease moved through the crowded camp with terrible ease. In its first year, Deadwood suffered an outbreak of smallpox, and the sick had to be gathered into isolated tents on the edge of the settlement, tended by the few who dared, while the rest of the town watched fearfully from a distance. There were no hospitals to speak of, few trained doctors, and little that medicine of the era could do against the infections that thrived in such conditions. A cut that turned septic, a fever that would not break, an accident in a mine shaft, any of these might kill a person as surely as a bullet, and far more often. Winter brought its own hardships, cutting the town off from easy supply, freezing the creek and testing the endurance of everyone who had come chasing gold into a high and unforgiving country. When the deep cold settled over the hills and the snow closed the roads, Deadwood drew in upon itself and waited. The wagons that were its lifeline could no longer come and go with ease, and prices for the goods already in the town could climb as supplies dwindled and the next shipment sat stranded somewhere out on the frozen plains. Firewood became precious, and the smoke of 100 stoves hung in the still, frigid air of the gulch. The placer miners, whose whole trade depended on running water, found their creeks locked in ice and their work brought to a halt, and many simply endured the months as best they could, huddled in drafty cabins, playing cards, telling stories, waiting for the thaw that would set the water running and the wagons rolling again. For all the town's frantic energy in the warm months, winter imposed a slower and harder rhythm,
a season of patience and endurance in which survival itself became the day's main work, and the gulch lay quiet under the snow, holding its breath until spring.
When sickness or injury came, as it came so often, the resources to meet it were thin. A few trained physicians did make their way to the hills, drawn like everyone else by the opportunity of a booming town, and they set up practice as best they could. But the medicine of the 1870s was limited in what it could do even in the finest hospitals of the great cities, and here in a remote camp its limits were sharper still. There were no antibiotics, no reliable defense against the infections that turned a minor wound into a mortal one. Surgery was crude and terribly dangerous, performed without the understanding of germs that later generations would take for granted. An apothecary might sell remedies of uncertain value, some helpful, some useless, some worse than the ailment they claimed to cure. And in the Chinese quarter, traditional physicians offered their own herbs and treatments to those who sought them. But against the great killers of the camp, the fevers and the infections and the epidemics that swept through the crowded valley, there was often little to be done but nursing, patience, and hope. And so the response to sickness became, above all, a matter of community, of neighbours sitting up through the night with the ill, of the kindness of strangers, of women who earned lasting respect by tending the sick when others feared to. It was in these quiet acts of care, far more than in any gunfight, that the real character of the town revealed itself, the ordinary human decency that persists even in the roughest places, and that the legends, fixed on their gamblers and their gunmen, so rarely pause to notice.
Into this difficult place, goods and people moved along a lifeline of roads that connected the isolated gulch to the wider world. Freight wagons drawn by long teams of oxen or mules hauled in the mountains of supplies the town required, creaking slowly over rough trails from distant railheads. Stagecoaches carried passengers, mail, and most temptingly, shipments of gold headed out of the hills, which made them a target for the road agents who lurked along the lonelier stretches of the route. The arrival of a coach or a freight train was an event, a moment of connection to the world beyond the hills, bringing letters from home and news of the nation and fresh faces to the crowded street. And around this constant movement of goods grew a whole economy of people who never once swung a pick.
This is one of the most important things to understand about a boomtown, and one that the legends almost always leave out. The great majority of the people who made Deadwood work were not miners at all. They were the merchants who sold the flour and the tools. They were the blacksmiths who shod the horses and repaired the equipment. They were the teamsters who drove the wagons, the carpenters who raised the buildings, the bakers and butchers and barbers, the hotel keepers and the bartenders, the doctors and the clerks and the laundry workers. And they were, importantly, women, who in a town so overwhelmingly male found real opportunity in running boarding houses, restaurants and laundries, and in providing the domestic services that a population of single men could not provide for themselves. Some of these women grew prosperous and respected. The town was not only a place of transient men chasing gold, it was also, quietly and from the very beginning, a place where families tried to build ordinary lives amid the noise and the mud.
So if you had walked the main street of Deadwood on a working morning in those early years, you would have seen far more of this ordinary life than of any gunfight. You would have smelled bread baking and coffee brewing, heard the ring of the blacksmith's hammer and the shouts of the freighters, watched shopkeepers arranging their goods, and children, yes, children, picking their way along the muddy boards.
you would have passed the offices of lawyers and assayers and newspapermen, for Deadwood had its own papers almost from the start, printing the news and the gossip and the advertisements of the camp. Those newspapers deserve a moment of their own, because they played a double role that runs to the very heart of this whole story. On the one hand, they were the practical nervous system of the town, carrying the ordinary information a community needs: the arrival of the stage, the prices of goods, the notices of claims and meetings and deaths, the small daily business of a place trying to become a real town. To read them now is to hear the authentic voice of Deadwood as it actually lived, unglamorous and busy and concerned with mud and freight and commerce far more than with gunfights. But on the other hand, these same papers and the larger papers back east that reprinted and embellished their stories were among the first engines of the Deadwood legend. A dramatic incident in the camp could be written up, sharpened, exaggerated, and sent out across the country, where it would be read by people who had never seen the hills and who took the printed word for the whole truth. The press recorded Deadwood and in the same motion began to mythologize it, and the two things happened so closely together that they can be hard to pull apart. The historian who wishes to know what really happened in the town must lean on these newspapers and must also read them with care, always asking how much is record and how much is already story. In that tension between the town as it was and the town as it was being written lies the whole puzzle we have been circling from the start. This was the daytime town, industrious and improvised and surprisingly ordinary, a community of people working hard to wring a living from a difficult place. Even in so worldly a place, there were those who came seeking not gold, but souls, and their presence is part of the fuller picture. The first preacher to reach the Black Hills gold camps was a man named Henry Weston Smith, remembered by later generations as Preacher Smith. He was not a young adventurer, but a middle-aged man from Connecticut, a former soldier who had also studied medicine. And he came to the hills in the spring of 1876, not to enrich himself, but, in his own words, to claim lives for God. He walked much of the long road from Cheyenne on foot, held what is remembered as the first church service in the hills at Custer City in early May, and then made his way to Deadwood, where he took the crowded, muddy main street itself as his church. He would stand in the open, often near a store or in front of a drugstore, and preach to the miners who gathered around him. And by many accounts they treated him with a rough respect, some of them removing their hats as he spoke, this earnest man calling for grace in the middle of a gold camp. During the week he supported himself with manual labor and sent his savings home to his family. And on Sundays he carried his message out to the surrounding camps as well.
His story ended in a way that reveals both the real dangers of the frontier and the difficulty of ever knowing the truth about them. On a Sunday morning in late August of 1876, only weeks after Hickok's killing, Smith preached in Deadwood, then tacked a simple note to his cabin door saying he had gone to Crook City to preach and, God willing, would return that afternoon. Friends, worried about the road, had urged him to carry a gun, and he is said to have answered that the Bible was his protection and had never failed him. On the road he was shot and killed. His body was found not far from the town, and, tellingly, he had not been robbed. In the years that followed, a monument was raised near the site, and it declared plainly that he had been killed by Indians. But
the truth of his death has long been debated, for the circumstances were murky, and some have wondered whether the convenient blame placed on native people obscured a more complicated story that will now never be known. He was buried in the hills above the town, and his death, coming so soon after Hickok's, deepened the sense that Deadwood was a place where sudden violence could take anyone, saint or gunfighter alike. Here too, though, the myth-makers were at work almost at once, and one man who had known him complained in later years that much of what the papers printed about Preacher Smith was pure romance, invented tales of him praying in saloons and the like, when the real man had simply preached in the street and gone quietly about his mission. Even the town's gentlest figure could not escape the frontier's habit of turning people into stories.
But when the sun dropped behind the steep walls of the gulch and darkness pooled in the narrow valley, another Deadwood woke and stretched and opened its doors. At night the character of the town changed. Lamplight spilled from open doorways onto the muddy street. Music drifted out from the halls and the theatres, and the crowds that had spent the day at labour gathered instead around the tables and the bars. This was the Deadwood of legend, the town of saloons and gambling and vice, and it is worth looking at plainly, without either the wide-eyed sensationalism of the dime novels or the prim disapproval of the moralists, because the nightlife of the town was, above all, a business, and a very profitable one.
The saloons and gambling halls existed because they served a real and predictable market. A mining camp is full of men who work hard, who are far from home, who have few comforts and fewer distractions, and who sometimes suddenly find themselves with money in their pockets after a good run at the diggings. Such men want somewhere to spend an evening, something to drink, some excitement to break the monotony of labour, and a chance, however foolish, to turn a little money into a lot. The proprietors of Deadwood's night establishments understood this appetite perfectly, and they built their fortunes on it. Whiskey was poured by the barrel, the gambling tables ran late into the night, and the house, as it always does, tended to win.
Gambling in the 19th century West had its own culture and its own favoured games. Poker, the game at which Hickok had lived and died, was played everywhere, a contest of nerve and calculation and bluff. But the great game of the frontier saloon was faro, now nearly forgotten, though in its day it was more popular than poker. Played against a dealer at a table marked with the images of cards, faro was fast, simple to follow, and easy to run, and it drew crowds wherever it was dealt. There were other games too, games of dice and chance and skill, all of them designed in the end to move money steadily from the players to the house. For the gambler who ran an honest table, the odds alone were enough to ensure a profit over time. For the gambler who ran a crooked one, and there were many, the profits came faster still.
Alongside the drinking and the gambling ran the other trades of the frontier night, the dance halls and the theatres, and the business of prostitution, which in the Deadwood of those years was open, widespread, and treated by many as simply another part of the economy. The lower end of the main street, where these establishments clustered, earned the nickname of the Badlands, and it was here that much of the town's reputation for wickedness was made. It would be dishonest to romanticize this world. For the women caught up in it, life was often hard, precarious, and dangerous, shaped by exploitation and by the harsh limits placed on women's choices in that time and place. But it would be equally dishonest to pretend it was not there,
or that it did not form a real and substantial part of how the town made its money. The women of Deadwood deserve more than a passing mention here, because their lives reveal a great deal about how a boomtown actually functioned, and because they are so often flattened in the legends into a single stock figure. In a town so overwhelmingly male, women found real, if narrow, avenues to independence and even prosperity. Some ran boarding houses and hotels, feeding and sheltering the endless stream of single men. Some ran restaurants and bakeries and laundries. Some kept shops or nursed the sick or taught the children who began to appear as families settled in. These were hard-won livelihoods in a difficult place, and the women who built them were, in their way, as essential to the town as any miner. And then there were the women of the Badlands, the dance-hall girls and the prostitutes, whose world was harsher and more precarious, shaped by exploitation and by the cruel limits placed on women's choices in that time. Some were trapped in it by debt or deception, as at Swearengen's gem. But a few, remarkably, turned even that grim trade into businesses of their own. The most successful of these was a madam named Dora Dufran, who over the years became, by some accounts, the most profitable brothel keeper in the region. A shrewd businesswoman operating within one of the few enterprises open to an ambitious woman on the frontier. She is also remembered for her kindness to those who worked for her, and in a curious link between two of Deadwood's famous names, for occasionally employing Calamity Jane, who worked for her at times as a cook and a helper. The real Deadwood was full of such women, resourceful and resilient, neither the helpless victims nor the glamorous adventuresses of the movies, but people making the best they could of a world that offered them very little, and sometimes making a great deal of it.
No single figure looms larger over this nighttime Deadwood than a man named Ellis Albert Swearengen, generally known as Al. Because his name has been carried to a vast modern audience by a celebrated television series, it is especially important here to separate the documented historical man from the fictional character who bears his name. For they are not the same, and the real record is both thinner and, in its way, grimmer than the drama. Swearengen was born in Iowa in the 1840s and arrived in Deadwood in the spring of 1876, among the earliest of the men who came not to mine but to profit from the miners. He first ran a modest saloon called the Cricket, where patrons could drink and gamble and watch bare-knuckle boxing matches, and from that beginning he built something larger.
In 1877, he opened the establishment for which he is remembered, the Gem, variously called the Gem Theatre or the Gem Variety Theatre, on the corner of Wall and Main. On its surface, the Gem was a place of entertainment, offering music, comedians, dancers, staged fights, and touring acts. And by the standards of a mining camp, it could put on a genuine show. But beneath that surface, and not very far beneath it, the Gem was a brothel, and Swearengen's methods of stuffing it were as cruel as anything in the town's history. According to accounts drawn from those who knew the place, he lured women to Deadwood with promises of respectable work on the stage or in service, and then, once they had arrived in the remote camp with no money and no way home, forced them into prostitution to pay off debts they had never truly owed. It was a trade built on deception and coercion, and the contemporary record, including the recollections of the town's own pioneers, remembers the Gem as a place of real misery beneath its lively entertainments.
Swearingen prospered nonetheless, and the gem became one of the most notorious and, by some reports, one of the most lucrative establishments in the Black Hills, said on its best nights to take in thousands of dollars. He survived the fires that repeatedly swept the town, rebuilding the gem more than once, and he maintained the political connections that kept the reformers at bay for years. But his end was far from triumphant. When a later fire destroyed the gem for the last time in the closing years of the century, Swearingen left Deadwood, and he died not long afterward, poor and largely alone, reportedly killed while trying to board a train far from the town he had helped make infamous. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain, whether accident or crime or something else, and in that final uncertainty he is a fitting emblem of the town's difficult night side, a real and often brutal world that the legends would later polish into mere colourful adventure.
The population that filled these streets and saloons was also far more varied than the traditional image of the West would suggest, and one community in particular deserves to be lifted out of the shadows into which later myth-making pushed it. Among the thousands who came to Deadwood seeking opportunity were a substantial number of Chinese immigrants, and their story is one of the most important and most overlooked chapters in the history of the town. The Chinese who came to the Black Hills were part of a much larger movement. Beginning around the middle of the century, many tens of thousands of people, most of them from the Canton region of southern China, had crossed the Pacific to work in the mines and on the railroads of the American West. As one gold strike gave way to another, they moved from place to place across the region, and when word of the Black Hills reached the older mining districts of California, Montana, and elsewhere, some of them made their way to Deadwood, arriving as early as the town's first years. By the late 1870s and into the 1880s, they had built a distinct and lively community at the northern end of the main street, a Chinatown that would serve as the social and cultural centre for Chinese people across the whole region for decades. Estimates of the size of Deadwood's Chinese community vary, as so many figures from the town do, but the numbers generally cited range from somewhat over 100 people to as many as several hundred at its height, making it the largest community in the town that was neither of European nor of American birth. And here a common assumption must be set aside. Most of Deadwood's Chinese residents did not, in fact, work the mines. They found their opportunities elsewhere, in trades that a booming and heavily male town desperately needed. They ran laundries, which in a place full of working men without wives or servants were essential and profitable businesses. They ran restaurants, and by some accounts a majority of the eating houses in the town were Chinese establishments, serving both familiar frontier fare and dishes new to their non-Chinese neighbours. They worked as merchants, as gardeners growing scarce fresh vegetables, as physicians practicing traditional medicine, and in a range of other trades that wove them into the daily economic life of the whole community. The most prominent figure of this community was a merchant named Phi Li Wong, better known by the name of his store, Wing Tzu. He had come to the hills in the gold rush years and built a thriving business, the Wing Tzu Emporium, on the main street, which sold imported silks, teas, porcelain, herbs, and a wealth of goods to Chinese and non-Chinese customers alike. He became a respected and comparatively wealthy citizen, raised a family in the town, and his son,
born in the 1880s, is remembered as the first Chinese child born in Deadwood. Phi Li Wong's long presence in the town and the eventual departure of his family back to China in the early 20th century traces in a single life the whole rise and slow fading of Chinese Deadwood.
It would be wrong, though, to tell this story as a simple tale of harmony. The Chinese in Deadwood lived under the shadow of the same prejudice that darkened the lives of Chinese people across the American West in those years. This was the era that produced the Chinese Exclusion Act, a federal law that barred Chinese laborers from immigrating and singled out an entire people for legal discrimination. And the hostility that produced such laws was present in the hills as well as in the halls of Congress. Chinese residents faced suspicion, social exclusion, and at times open contempt. And yet the situation in Deadwood was, by some measures, less harsh than in many other Western communities, in part because most Chinese residents stayed out of the gold mining that provoked the fiercest resentment elsewhere, and in part because the territory placed no barrier on their owning property, so that they held title to most of the buildings in their own quarter. Curious neighbours visited Chinatown for its goods and its novelties, and a genuine, if limited, exchange took place across the cultural line. Discrimination and a measure of coexistence lived side by side, as they so often did.
Much of what we now know about this community comes not from the celebrated stories of the town, but from the patient work of archaeologists. In the early years of the 21st century, careful excavations at the site of the old Chinatown recovered a wealth of artifacts buried beneath the modern town. Fragments of porcelain, coins, gaming pieces, medicine bottles, and the everyday objects of a vanished neighbourhood. These finds have allowed historians to reconstruct the texture of Chinese life in Deadwood far more fully than the written record alone would permit. The physical Chinatown itself has almost entirely disappeared, worn away by fire, by the decline of the community as the mining economy faded, and in one especially painful episode, by the demolition of one of the last surviving original buildings early in this century, an act that caused real anguish in a town that prides itself on preserving its past. What remains is largely underground and in memory, and it stands as a quiet correction to the whitewashed version of the frontier. The real Deadwood was a place of many peoples, and any honest telling of its story must make room for the community that the legends so nearly erased.
There is another figure who has become nearly impossible to separate from the Deadwood of legend, and whose story reveals, better than almost any other, how the myths of the frontier were made. Her name was Martha Jane Canary, and history remembers her as Calamity Jane. She arrived in the town in that same eventful summer of 1876, riding in the same wagon company as Wild Bill Hickok, and from that moment her name and his would be braided together in the popular imagination, though the truth of their connection is far thinner than the legend insists.
The facts of her early life are genuinely difficult to establish, in part because she herself worked so diligently to obscure them. She was born, most likely, in Missouri in the early 1850s, one of several children in a poor and unsettled family. Orphaned young, she made her way west and drifted through the mining camps and army posts of the frontier, taking whatever work she could find, and along the way she adopted the habits that would make her famous, wearing men's clothing, drinking heavily,
swearing freely and telling tall tales about herself to anyone who would listen. By the time she reached Deadwood, still only in her early 20s, she was already known by her nickname and already the subject of gossip and wonder.
Where did the name Calamity Jane come from? The honest answer is that no one truly knows. She herself offered a dramatic explanation, claiming that an army officer had bestowed the name upon her after she rescued him during a fight with native warriors, naming her the heroine of the plains. But there is no reliable evidence for this story, and historians generally treat it with skepticism. Other explanations have been suggested, that to offend her was to court calamity, or simply that Jane was a common nickname and her calamitous life supplied the rest. The origin is lost, and like so much about her, it has been filled in by legend.
Much of what the world believes about Calamity Jane comes from a short autobiographical pamphlet that she dictated in the 1890s, near the end of her life. And this document must be handled with great care, because it is riddled with exaggeration and invention. In its pages she cast herself as a daring army scout, a pony express rider, a fearless heroine of countless adventures. But the careful work of modern historians, most notably a biographer who spent decades untangling her life from her legend, has concluded that many of these claims cannot be supported. She was very probably never an army scout in any formal sense. The tales of her heroinism owe more to the dime novels that seized upon her colourful figure than to anything she actually did. What emerges instead, when the inventions are stripped away, is a more human and in some ways more sympathetic person. A woman who defied the narrow expectations placed on women of her time, who could be genuinely kind and generous, who was remembered for nursing the sick during outbreaks of disease, and who struggled all her life with poverty and with drink.
And what of her famous connection to Wild Bill Hickok? Here, too, the legend far outruns the evidence. It is true that they travelled to Deadwood in the same company and knew each other in the town during the few weeks before his death. But the romantic bond that later stories built between them, the secret marriage, the child, the great lost love, appears to have little or no basis in fact. The most careful historians conclude that the two were, at most, acquaintances, and that the romance was largely a later invention, woven together by writers, and, in her final years, encouraged by Calamity Jane herself, who seems to have found in her supposed link to the famous gunfighter a kind of fame and comfort. She asked near her death to be buried beside him, and she was, in the cemetery in the hills above the town, so that the two lie together in death far more intimately than they ever were in life. It is a fitting resting place for two people who became, more than almost anyone, symbols rather than selves, their real lives buried beneath the stories told about them.
But while Hickok and Calamity Jane came to stand for the old, wild, mythologized Deadwood, another man who arrived in that same crowded summer represented something entirely different, and in the long run far more consequential. He stood for order, for property, for business, and for the slow, unglamorous arrival of formal law. His name was Seth Bullock.
Bullock came to Deadwood not as a gunfighter, but as a merchant, and this is the first thing to understand about him, because it cuts against the image the later legends would build. He had been born in Canada and had spent time in Montana, where he had served in public office and worked in business, and he arrived in the Black Hills in the summer of 1876 with a partner named Solomon Starr
and a wagon full of hardware to sell. By a striking coincidence, the two men reached the town within a day or two of Hickok's killing, so that Bullock, the man who would come to symbolize law and order in Deadwood, arrived just as the town's most famous act of lawlessness was fresh in every mouth. He and Starr set up their store, at first little more than a tent, and began selling the picks and pans and lumber and tools that the booming camp devoured, and their firm quickly became one of the more successful businesses on the main street.
It was only after this, and partly because of the shock of Hickok's murder and the farce of McCall's acquittal, that Bullock moved towards the role for which he is remembered. As the boom grew and the need for real government became impossible to ignore, the machinery of the territory finally began to reach the hills. This could only happen because of a change in the land's legal status, for as long as the back hills remained treaty land closed to settlement, no lawful county or court could be established there. That barrier was removed, as we will see, by the same act of Congress that stripped the hills from the Lakota. Once that had happened, the territory could organize the region, and early in 1877 a new county, Lawrence County, was created, taking in Deadwood and the surrounding camps. The governor of the Dakota Territory appointed Seth Bullock to serve as its first sheriff until elections could be held later that year.
Bullock's time as sheriff was short, lasting only a matter of months, but he took the work seriously, appointing deputies and setting about the task of bringing order to a rowdy camp. And here the historical record offers a detail that quietly undercuts the whole gunfighter legend of the West. By the accounts that come down to us, Seth Bullock never killed a man during his time as sheriff. His authority rested not on his gun, but on his bearing, his evident fearlessness, and a famously intimidating stare. And again, this was enough to settle a confrontation before it turned to violence. This is worth dwelling on because it runs so contrary to what we expect. The man remembered as the lawman who tamed the wildest town in the West did so, as far as we can tell, without adding a single killing of his own to the tally.
It is also worth correcting a common misunderstanding, one that even the town's own popular history sometimes repeats. Bullock is often called Deadwood's first lawman, but this is not quite accurate. Before the formal county was created, the miners' court had chosen marshals of its own, improvised officers with the same uncertain authority as the court that appointed them, and the first of these met a violent end when he was ambushed and killed along the road outside the town. Bullock's importance lies not in being first, but in being formal. He represented the moment when authority in Deadwood stopped resting on the shifting will of a crowd and began resting on the recognized structures of territorial government, on appointment and election, on statute and office.
And once that transition began, it moved with remarkable speed. This is one of the most surprising truths about Deadwood, and one that the legend of endless lawlessness entirely conceals. The genuinely chaotic phase of the town, the period when it truly had no lawful government at all, was astonishingly brief. Within a couple of years of the first cabins rising along the creek, the town had a mayor and a charter, a sheriff and a county, courts with real authority, elected officials, and the ordinary apparatus of municipal life. Property was recorded, taxes were levied, disputes flowed into proper courtrooms rather than improvised theatres. The town that had begun as an illegal camp on forbidden ground was folded, step by step, into the legal and political order of the United States.
and the people who had rushed in to dig for gold found themselves, almost before they knew it, living as citizens of an ordinary American town, with all the paperwork and regulation that implied. The wild years were real. They were simply far shorter than the stories would ever admit.
But even as law arrived and the town settled towards respectability, it remained vulnerable to a danger that no sheriff could arrest and no court could sentence. The gulch was crowded with wooden buildings, warmed by stoves and lit by open flame, packed tightly together on the narrow valley floor, and it sat in a country of hard winters and unpredictable water. Deadwood, like every frontier town of its kind, lived always in the shadow of catastrophe, and the catastrophes, when they came, would prove far deadlier than any gunfighter who ever walked its streets.
The greatest of these dangers was fire, and to understand why, you have only to picture the town itself. Deadwood was built almost entirely of wood, of pine cut green from the surrounding hills and thrown up in haste. The buildings crowded shoulder to shoulder along the narrow street, with scarcely a gap between them. Inside those buildings, people cooked over open flames and heated their rooms with wood-burning stoves and stored barrels of whiskey and kerosene and other things that burned all too eagerly. It was, in a sense, a town built of kindling and packed with sources of ignition, wedged into a valley so narrow that a fire once started would have nowhere to go but from building to building. Everyone who lived there must have known, at some level, that it was only a matter of time.
The reckoning came in the autumn of 1879. A fire broke out, by most accounts beginning in a bakery, and in the dry conditions and crowded construction, it spread with terrifying speed. Before it could be stopped, it had consumed a great swathe of the town, destroying, by the common estimate, more than 300 buildings, and leaving a large part of the population without homes or businesses or possessions. For many who had come to the hills with everything they owned, the fire took it all in a single night. It was one of the defining catastrophes of the town's history, a disaster that in a few hours undid years of building.
And yet what happened next reveals something essential about the spirit of the place. Deadwood rebuilt. It rebuilt quickly, and it rebuilt differently. Where the burned town had been made of wood, much of the new town rose in brick and stone, more solid, more permanent, more resistant to the flames that had devoured its predecessor. The disaster, terrible as it was, marked a turning point in the town's physical character, hastening its transformation from a temporary-looking camp of raw timber into something that looked and felt like a lasting American town. Many of the handsome brick buildings that give the historic centre of Deadwood its character today date from this era of rebuilding, raised by people determined that the next fire would not so easily undo them. Fire would return again in later years, for no frontier town could ever fully escape it. But the town that rose from the ashes of that great blaze was sturdier and more confident than the one that had burned.
Fire was the most dramatic of the town's dangers, but it was not the deadliest. That grim distinction belonged to the quieter perils of water and disease and accident, which killed steadily and without spectacle. Flooding was a recurring threat in the narrow gulch, where heavy rains or melting snow could send water surging down the confined valley with sudden force, sweeping through the low-lying parts of the town.
The same creek that flooded also carried the town's waste, and contaminated water spread the diseases that thrived in crowded and unsanitary conditions. Outbreaks of illness moved through the population, and in an age before modern medicine there was often little to be done but nurse the sick and bury the dead. And in the mines themselves, and in the mills and workshops that served them, accidents took a steady toll. A fall of rock, a slip, a moment's carelessness around heavy machinery, any of which could maim or kill.
If you were to tally, honestly, the causes of death in early Deadwood, the famous gunfights would make up only a small fraction of the whole. Far more people were carried off by fever and infection, by fire and flood, by the ordinary accidents of hard physical labor in a dangerous trade, than were ever shot down in the saloons. This is one of the most important corrections that the real history offers to the legend. The classic image of the Wild West fixes its gaze on the man with the revolver, on the shootout and the killing, as though violence between armed men were the great danger of frontier life. But the true dangers were humbler and more relentless. The germ in the water, and the flame in the stove, and the rock in the mine. The revolver killed occasionally. The environment killed constantly. And Deadwood survived them all and kept growing, because beneath the drama and the disaster, something durable was taking root. The temporary gold camp was becoming a permanent American town, and the thing that anchored it was a change in the very nature of the mining that had created it.
To understand that change, we have to understand the difference between two kinds of gold mining, because the shift from one to the other transformed everything about the Black Hills. The first kind, the kind that had drawn the earliest rush, was placer mining. This was the mining of the lone prospector, with his pan and his rocker, working the loose gold that had eroded out of the rock over ages and settled into the gravel of the stream beds. Placer gold could be gathered by hand, by anyone willing to endure the cold water and the back-breaking labour, and it required little capital, only muscle and patience and luck. It was democratic in a rough way. A poor man with a pan had at least a chance.
It is worth slowing down to picture the actual labour, because it was nothing like the romantic image of a man crouched dreamily beside a sparkling stream. Placer mining was cold, wet, monotonous, and brutally hard on the body. In its simplest form, the miner filled a shallow pan with gravel from the stream bed, added water, and swirled it in a patient circular motion, letting the lighter sand and grit wash over the lip, while the heavier gold, if there was any, settled to the bottom. It was slow work, done bent over hour after hour, hands numb in the icy snowmelt, back aching, eyes straining for the faint gleam among the black sand. To move more ground, miners built simple machines from the timber around them. There was the rocker, a wooden box on curved runners that a man rocked back and forth like a cradle, while pouring in gravel and water, the motion trapping the gold behind small wooden bars. And there was the sluice, a long open trough down which a steady stream of water carried the washed gravel, with cross pieces along the bottom to catch the gold as it sank. All of it depended on water, and on the simple fact that gold is heavy, heavier than almost anything else in the stream bed, so that with enough washing it could be made to settle out and stay behind. Day after day, in sun and in freezing water, the miners fed the gravel through and watched the bottom of the sluice, and most of them, for all their labour, found little more than enough to keep going, while the dream of the great strike stayed always just ahead, in the next bend of the creek, in the next pan of gravel.
But placer gold is limited. The loose metal in the streams is only what has washed down over the centuries from its source.
And once the easy ground has been worked over, the free gold grows scarcer and harder to find. The prospectors who crowded Deadwood Gulch in 1876 were, without fully realizing it, drawing down a finite deposit. And within a few years, the richest placer ground had been claimed and worked and largely exhausted. The source of all that gold, though, still lay locked in the hard rock of the hills, and reaching it required something entirely different from a pan and a strong back. It required capital, machinery, engineering, and organization on a scale that no lone prospector could command.
This was lode mining, the mining of the gold still bound within solid rock, and it belonged not to individuals but to companies. And the greatest of these companies, the one that would define the future of the region, grew up not in Deadwood itself, but in the neighbouring town of Lead, a short distance away, where the richest body of ore in the whole district was found. The claim had been staked in 1876 by a pair of brothers, and it would become known as the Homestake. Its significance drew the attention of men with the money to develop it, and foremost among them was a mining magnate named George Hurst, who together with his partners bought the claim and set about building it into an industrial enterprise.
The Homestake became one of the most productive gold mines in the history of the United States, and indeed of the entire hemisphere. Under Hurst and the company he helped found, the operation grew into a vast industrial complex with deep shafts, great crushing mills whose stamps thundered day and night, and a workforce of hundreds and then thousands of paid labourers. It would operate astonishingly for well over a century, descending thousands of feet into the earth and yielding tens of millions of ounces of gold before it finally closed at the dawn of the 21st century.
The mine reshaped not only Deadwood, but the neighbouring town of Lead, which grew up around it as a company town in the fullest sense, its life organised around the great enterprise beneath it. The company owned much, shaped much, and set the rhythm of the town's days by the shifts of the mine, and this arrangement carried both hardship and a certain paternalistic generosity. The wife of one of the company's founders, Phoebe Hurst, took a particular interest in improving the lives of the mining families, and her name became attached to a series of gifts that softened the roughness of a company town. She helped establish a free public library and a free kindergarten for the children of the miners and mill workers, supported the local churches, and provided scholarships so that the sons and daughters of labouring families might have chances their parents never had. In time, the company would furnish the town with an opera house and a recreation building as well, places of culture and leisure grafted onto a working mining community. There is a real complexity in all of this, for the same enterprise that offered libraries and scholarships also held enormous power over the lives and livelihoods of its workers and consolidated its control of the district by methods that were not always gentle. But it is part of the honest picture of what industrial mining brought to the Black Hills. The lone prospector's wild rush had given way to something more orderly, more permanent, and more paternal, a world of steady wages and company libraries and shift whistles, as different from the chaos of 1876 as could well be imagined, and yet grown directly out of it. It was, for generations, the beating economic heart of the northern Black Hills, and its story is the story of how a wild rush for loose gold in the creeks matured into a stable industry built on payrolls and machinery and corporate ownership.
That transformation changed the whole society of the region. The lone prospector, the romantic figure of the early rush, gave way to the wage-earning miner, who went down into the company's shafts in the morning and came up in the evening and collected a paycheck, his fortunes tied not to a lucky strike, but to the steady operation of a great enterprise. The men who grew truly wealthy from the Black Hills were for the most part not the diggers, but the investors and the industrialists, the men with the capital to buy the claims and build the mills. And around this maturing industry, the town of Deadwood settled into a new and steadier prosperity. Railroads eventually reached the hills, ending the long isolation that had made everything so costly, and bringing goods and people in, and carrying gold and ore out with a speed the old freight wagons could never match. Telegraph lines connected the town to the nation's flow of news. Banks were established to hold the region's wealth. Fine hotels and solid public buildings rose along the streets. The rough camp of tents and mud had become, within a single generation, a settled and connected American town, with all the institutions and comforts and routines that implied.
You could mark the change, if you had lived through it, in 100 small ways. The sounds of the town shifted from the hammering of hasty construction to the rhythms of established business. The population steadied as transient fortune hunters gave way to families who meant to stay. Churches and schools took their place alongside the saloons. The great questions of daily life became less about survival and sudden riches, and more about the ordinary concerns of any town: commerce and property and community and the future. Somewhere in those years, though no one could have named the exact day, Deadwood stopped being a gold rush and started being a home. And yet, for all this success, all this maturing prosperity, the town could never quite escape the shadow of the injustice at its root. The gold that built it had been found on land that was never lawfully open to it, and the reckoning for that theft was unfolding even as the town grew rich.
Before we return to that wider story, though, linger a little longer on the roads themselves, because the lifelines that connected Deadwood to the world tell us as much about the real texture of frontier life as any gunfight ever could, and they are among the most overlooked parts of the whole story. For all its sudden wealth, Deadwood sat in a deep pocket of the hills, hundreds of miles from the nearest railroad in its early years, and everything the town needed and everything it produced had to travel those long and lonely miles overland. The roads were the arteries of the town's life, and the people who worked them belonged to a set of trades that the legends have almost entirely forgotten.
Consider the freighter, the teamster who drove the great supply wagons across the plains and into the hills. His was one of the essential occupations of the frontier, and one of the hardest. Long strings of oxen or mules, sometimes a dozen or more animals to a team, hauled enormous wagons loaded with everything a booming town devoured: flour and bacon and beans, picks and shovels and pans, lumber and glass and stoves, barrels of whiskey and bolts of cloth and cases of goods of every kind. A single freight outfit might stretch a remarkable distance along the road, the wagons linked together, the driver walking or riding alongside, urging the animals on across the open country in all weathers. The journeys took many days, sometimes weeks, over rough trails that turned to dust in the summer and to deep and clinging mud in the wet seasons. And along the way lay real dangers, from the ordinary hazards of a broken axle or a lame animal in the middle of nowhere, to the graver threat of robbery, or, in the war years, of ambush. When one of these great freight trains came creaking into Deadwood at last, dusty and weary and piled high, it was a lifeline arriving, and the whole economy of the town depended on the men who drove them. Alongside the slow freight wagons ran the faster and more famous stagecoaches, which carried passengers and mail and news, and, most temptingly of all, gold. Stage lines connected Deadwood to the distant railheads, and to ride one was to spend long, jolting days crammed into a swaying coach, the country rolling past, the driver high on his box working the reins over the teams, the stations appearing at intervals along the road, where fresh horses waited and travellers could stretch and eat before climbing aboard again for the next stretch. The arrival of the stage was one of the great daily events of the town, bringing letters from families far away, newspapers full of the doings of the wider world, and new faces stepping down stiff and dusty into the crowded street. In a place so isolated, that thread of connection to home and nation was precious beyond measure, and the coming of the mail could turn an ordinary afternoon into an occasion. But the stagecoaches carried something that made them targets, and this is where the roads acquired their genuine drama. As the homestake and the other mines poured out their wealth, that gold had to be carried out of the hills to the banks and the mints of the east, and it travelled, at least in part, aboard the coaches. Shipments of gold were a temptation almost beyond resistance to the road agents, the highwaymen who lurked along the lonelier stretches of the route, waiting in the timber or behind the rocks for a coach to come labouring up a grade where the horses slowed. To meet this threat, the express companies took extraordinary measures. They built special treasure coaches, reinforced with iron plating and fitted with heavy strongboxes, rolling strong rooms designed to carry the gold safely through hostile country. And they hired guards, the men remembered as shotgun messengers, who rode beside the driver with weapons ready, watching the roadside for the ambush that might come at any turn.
And around all this movement of goods and people and gold clustered a whole world of forgotten trades, the humble occupations that kept the arteries of the town flowing. There were the hostlers who tended the horses at the stage stations, and the station keepers who fed and sheltered the travellers. There were the wagon makers and the wheelwrights who built and repaired the vehicles, and the harness makers who kept the leather sound. There were the men who cut and hauled the timber, and the men who cut the wild hay to feed the animals through the winter, and the many hands who loaded and unloaded the endless freight. None of these people became legends. No dime novel was ever written about a hostler or a wheelwright, and yet without them the town could not have lived for a week, for a mining camp cut off in the hills survives only so long as the roads keep bringing in what it cannot make for itself. When you imagine Deadwood, then, imagine not only the gambler and the gunfighter, but the teamster leaning into the harness on a cold morning, the shotgun messenger scanning the timber from his seat beside the driver, the hostler leading a tired team into the station yard at dusk. They were the real and unglamorous heroes of the frontier, and the town rode on their backs.
There is a deeper truth hidden in all this movement, and it is worth pausing on before we turn back to the larger story. The romantic image of the West is an image of freedom and isolation, of self-reliant individuals carving out lives beyond the reach of society. But Deadwood, like every town of its kind, was in truth utterly dependent on its connections to the wider world. Its food came from far away, its tools came from far away, its gold went far away, its news, its mail, its very sense of belonging to a nation, all came down those long roads from beyond the hills. The lone prospector panning in the creek was not in fact alone at all. He was the end point of an immense web of labour and transport and commerce that reached back across the plains to the factories and farms and railroads of the settled country. And without that web he would have starved in a month. The frontier was never truly a place apart. It was the leading edge of a vast and interconnected society, reaching out into new country. And Deadwood, in its narrow gulch, was tied by 1,000 threads to the world it seemed to have left behind. That web of connection is invisible in the legends, which prefer the solitary hero, but it was the true foundation on which the whole life of the town was built.
And so, having followed the roads out across the plains and back again, we come at last to the wider story we set aside when we first entered the gulch. The story of the treaty and the land and the people to whom the Black Hills belonged. For while the miners were digging and the merchants were selling and the town was rising along the creek, a war was being fought over the very ground beneath their feet, and its outcome would decide whether Deadwood could exist at all.
Recall the situation as it stood. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had guaranteed the Black Hills to the Lakota, and the United States had pledged to keep white settlers out. But the discovery of gold had sent thousands of prospectors pouring across that boundary, and the government proved unwilling or unable to stop them. Faced with this flood of its own trespassing citizens, the United States did not, in the end, enforce its treaty. Instead, it moved to take the land. In the years before the rush, the government had tried to buy the hills, sending commissioners to negotiate with the Lakota leaders. But the offers were refused, for the hills were not for sale at any price the Lakota would accept. When purchase failed, pressure and force took its place.
The government issued an ultimatum ordering the Lakota bands who lived in freely off the reservation to come in to the agencies by a fixed deadline in the winter, an order that was, given the season and the distances, nearly impossible to obey, and was widely understood as a pretext. When the deadline passed, the army was sent against them, and the conflict known as the Great Sioux War or the Black Hills War began. It was a war fought across the northern plains in 1876 and into 1877, and it produced the single most famous battle in the history of the American West, when a large gathering of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors overwhelmed and destroyed a detachment of the 7th Cavalry under George Armstrong Custer at the Little Bighorn River, in the very summer that Deadwood was being born. It was the same Custer whose expedition had announced the gold 2 years before, and his death became a national shock that hardened the nation's resolve against the very people defending their treaty land. For the Lakota, the victory at the Little Bighorn was extraordinary, but it could not be sustained against the full weight of the United States. In the months that followed, the army pursued the scattered bands relentlessly, destroying their camps and their supplies, wearing down their ability to resist through the hard winter. The campaign touched Deadwood directly in one strange and vivid episode. Late in the summer of that year, a large column of soldiers under General George Crook
worn down by long marching and dwindling rations as they pursued the Lakota, grew so short of food that they were reduced to eating their own broken-down horses, and the exhausted, starving command at last staggered into the Deadwood region in search of supplies. The soldiers who came into the gold camp on what became remembered as the Horsemeat March were a haggard sight, and their arrival collapsed the distance between the war on the plains and the booming town in the gulch, a reminder to everyone in Deadwood that the fortune they were chasing was being wrung from a land that armies were fighting and dying to take. And while the soldiers pressed the war in the field, Congress moved to accomplish by law what it wanted from the land. It attached to a bill funding the Lakota's promised rations a stark condition, one that later generations would call the sell or starve provision. Under its terms, the government would provide no more of the food and supplies it had pledged by treaty unless the Lakota gave up the Black Hills. A people already pressed by war and dependent on those rations for survival were told in effect to surrender their sacred land or face starvation.
A commission was sent to obtain the signatures that would make the cession legal. But recall the crucial provision of the 1868 treaty that no valid surrender of the land could occur without the signatures of 3 out of every 4 adult Lakota men. The commission did not come close to meeting that requirement. By the accounts that survive, it gathered the marks of only around 1/10 of the adult men, a small fraction of what the treaty demanded. It did not matter. Congress took the incomplete and coerced agreement and enacted it into law in early 1877, declaring the Black Hills open and the cession complete. By the plain terms of the nation's own treaty, the taking was unlawful, but it was done, and with it the legal barrier that had made Deadwood a trespassers' town was swept away. The county could be organized, the sheriff appointed, the courts established. Deadwood became a lawful American town at the precise moment and by the precise act that the Lakota lost their sacred hills.
This was the true cost of the gold rush, and it is why the story of Deadwood can never be only a tale of adventure and fortune. The town's very legitimacy was purchased with a dispossession, and the injustice of that act did not fade with time. The Lakota never accepted the loss as just, and they pursued the matter generation after generation through the slow machinery of the law. Their claim wound through the courts across the better part of a century, until at last, in the year 1980, it reached the highest court in the land. In the case known as the United States against the Sioux Nation of Indians, the Supreme Court considered the taking of the Black Hills and delivered a judgment of remarkable bluntness. It found that the seizure had indeed been a taking of property for which compensation was owed, and one of the justices, writing for the majority, declared that a more ripe and rank case of dishonourable dealings would scarcely be found in the whole history of the nation. The court awarded a sum of money, the value of the land at the time of the taking, together with a century of accumulated interest, amounting to more than $100 million.
But the story does not end with that judgment, and this is perhaps the most striking part of all. The Lakota refused the money. They had never wanted payment, they wanted the hills, and so they declined to accept the award, insisting instead on the return of the land itself, and the money has sat untouched in a government account ever since, growing year by year with interest into a vast sum that no one will claim, because to claim it would be to accept the sale of something the Lakota have always held to be beyond sale. Pahasapa, the heart of their world, is not in their understanding a thing that money can buy back. And so the oldest question in the story of Deadwood, the question of who the land truly belongs to, remains in the deepest sense unresolved to this day, more than a century and a half after the first miners walked up the gulch of the dead trees.
And here we arrive at the strangest transformation of all, stranger even than the change from camp to town. For as the real Deadwood settled into ordinary civic life, a second Deadwood was being born, an imagined Deadwood, made not of timber and brick, but of ink and film and story. And it was this imagined town that would conquer the memory of the world. Even before the wild years had fully ended, the process of turning them into legend had already begun. And to understand the Deadwood we think we know, we have to watch that legend being made.
It began with the newspapers and the dime novels, the same machinery of sensation that had inflated Hickok into a mythic hero while he still lived. To readers in the crowded cities of the East, the Black Hills gold rush was thrilling raw material, a story of danger and fortune in a wild and distant land, and writers gave those readers what they wanted. The realities of the town, the mud and the disease, the merchants and the laundries, the patient labor of ordinary people made poor copy. But a gunfighter shot dead at a card table, a lawless camp where justice came from the barrel of a revolver, a colourful woman in buckskin swaggering down the street. These were stories that sold. And so the writers seized upon the dramatic and the violent, the handful of famous names and the handful of famous incidents, and pushed the rest into shadow.
Nothing illustrates this better than the strange career of a hero who never existed at all. In 1877, only a year after the events we have been tracing, a writer named Edward Wheeler, who had never set foot in the Black Hills, published the first of a long series of cheap adventure stories featuring a dashing masked outlaw hero he called Deadwood Dick, the Black Rider of the Black Hills. Deadwood Dick was pure invention, a creature of the imagination, dreamed up by an author sitting far away in the East. But Wheeler did something clever and consequential. He placed his invented hero in real locations, the actual streets and hills of a real and newly famous town, and he had him move among real historical people, so that Calamity Jane, the living woman, appeared in the stories as the hero's gunslinging companion. This blurring of the invented and the real was so effective that many readers came to believe Deadwood Dick was an actual person, and over the following decades a number of men would even claim for their own advantage to be the original. The stories poured out, dozens upon dozens of them, and when Wheeler died, the publisher simply carried the character on under other hands. The fictional Deadwood Dick became, for a time, more famous than almost any real resident of the town, and the fictional Calamity Jane, who rode beside him, bore almost no resemblance to the troubled and human Martha Canary, who had actually walked the muddy street.
This was how the machinery worked, again and again. A real place and real people were mined for their colour, then reshaped into something more thrilling and less true, until the reshaped version crowded out the original. There is a poignant footnote to the Deadwood Dick story that captures the whole tangle. A formerly enslaved black cowboy named Nat Love, a genuinely remarkable figure who had lived a real and adventurous life on the frontier,
later claimed the title of Deadwood Dick for himself, saying he had earned it in a contest of roping and shooting in the town. Whether or not the claim was strictly true, it shows how a fictional legend could become so powerful that real people reached out to attach themselves to it, hoping to borrow some of its light. The invented hero had become more solid in the public mind than the Fliftian blood people whose town had given him his name.
The process only accelerated as the decades passed. The great travelling spectacles of the age, the Wild West shows that toured the country and even crossed the ocean to Europe, took the frontier and turned it into performance, complete with staged shootouts and reenacted dramas. And figures connected to Deadwood found places in that world of paid spectacle. Calamity Jane herself, in her later years, appeared in such shows and sold the pamphlet of her invented life, becoming a performer of her own legend. Memoirs were written, some by people who had truly been there, and some by people who merely claimed to have been. And even the honest ones tended to remember the exciting years and forget the dull ones. Tourism came to the hills, and the town learned that its wild past was a treasure it could sell, and began quite deliberately to market itself as the place where Wild Bill had died and the frontier had run free.
This turn towards selling the past would only deepen as the decades passed, until it became one of the central facts of the town's modern existence. Deadwood began to stage celebrations of its own frontier days, festivals that gathered the old pioneers and reenacted the famous episodes for crowds of visitors. And the killing of Wild Bill in particular became a set piece, performed again and again for audiences who came to the hills to touch a piece of the legend. The very buildings of the old town, the brick storefronts raised after the Great Fire, became valuable precisely because they were old, relics of the frontier that visitors wished to see. In time, the historic heart of the town would be recognized as a place of national significance, its character carefully protected. And later still, when the town's fortunes flagged, its people would turn once more to its past for salvation, reviving legalized gambling in the closing years of the 20th century, in part to raise the money needed to preserve the very streets and buildings that the legend had made famous. There is a deep irony in this, and it is worth sitting with. The town that had been born chasing gold now made its living, in large part, by selling the story of having chased gold. The myth had become the industry. And every visitor who came to watch a stage shootout or to stand at the marked spot where Hickok fell was, without quite realizing it, taking part in the very process of myth-making that had been remaking Deadwood since the summer the real Wild Bill died. The legend was not a thing that had happened once, long ago, and then stopped. It was and is a living thing, retold and reenacted and sold anew to each generation, growing a little further from the truth with every telling. Then came the 20th century, and the most powerful storyteller of all, the moving picture. Film after film returned to the frontier, and to the familiar cast of gunfighters and lawmen and dance-hall women, and each retelling pressed the legend deeper into the public mind. Television carried it further still, into the living rooms of millions, and in our own time a celebrated dramatic series brought a vivid, profane and deliberately theatrical Deadwood to a vast new audience, its characters bearing the names of real people, Bullock and Swearingen and the rest, but speaking and acting according to the needs of drama rather than the record of history.
That series is a remarkable work of storytelling. It is not, and does not claim to be, a documentary. And yet for a great many people it is now the truest Deadwood they know, its invented conflicts and heightened characters standing in memory where the real and more complicated town once stood.
Watch how this machinery works across all its forms, and you see the same pattern again and again. It compresses. It takes years of history and squeezes them into a single vivid image, so that the whole life of the town collapses into one violent summer, the summer of Hickok's death, as though nothing before or after mattered. It selects, it seizes on a few famous figures, the gunfighter, the frontierswoman, the lawman, the villain, and lets the thousands of ordinary people who actually built the town, the miners and merchants and immigrants and families, fade into an anonymous backdrop. And it exaggerates, always tending toward the dramatic version of any uncertain event, preferring the shootout to the sickbed, the gambler to the shopkeeper, the legend to the fact. Popular culture prefers gunfighters to merchants because gunfighters make a better show, and over a century and a half of retelling, that preference has hardened into what most people believe.
Why do certain people become famous while thousands vanish from memory? It is not because the famous ones were more important to the actual life of the town. Phi Li Wong the merchant and the countless unnamed labourers shaped Deadwood far more than the drifter McCall ever did. The famous became famous because their stories fit the shape that the storytellers wanted, the shape of drama and danger and romance. And so the memory of Deadwood became a kind of funhouse mirror, reflecting the real town back in a form stretched and distorted toward violence and away from ordinary life. Which leaves us, at the end of our long walk through the gulch, with the question that has followed us the whole way, the question we must now try as honestly as we can to answer. Was Deadwood really the most lawless town in America? Let us gather the evidence carefully, the way a fair-minded jury might, weighing what supports the legend against what complicates it, and let us resist the temptation to settle for a simple verdict, where the truth is more subtle.
There is genuine substance behind Deadwood's reputation, and we should not pretend otherwise. The town truly did begin as an authorized settlement on land where white settlement was forbidden by treaty, so that in its earliest days it existed entirely outside the recognized legal order of the nation. For a real, if short, period, it had no lawful court, no lawful sheriff, no lawful government of any kind, and justice, such as it was, came from improvised miners' courts, whose verdicts had no standing in law, as the farce of McCall's acquittal so vividly showed. Violence did occur, famous killings did take place, gambling and prostitution flourished openly, and figures like Swearingen ran establishments of real cruelty. The Badlands at the lower end of the street were exactly what their name suggested. None of this is invented. The wild Deadwood was, in its founding years, a genuinely rough and improvised and lawless place, and the legend is not built on nothing.
But now, set beside that the other half of the evidence, which the legend so carefully forgets. From almost its first weeks, the town was inventing rules and institutions, recording claims, resolving disputes, organizing itself with a speed that suggests not a love of anarchy, but a deep hunger for order. Businesses operated, families settled, newspapers printed, churches gathered.
Within a couple of years, the improvised camp had a mayor and a charter, a county and a sheriff, real courts and elected officials, and had been folded into the ordinary legal order of the territory. The genuinely lawless phase, the period without any formal government at all, was remarkably brief, a matter of a couple of years at most, after which Deadwood settled with surprising haste toward the routines of ordinary civic life.
And when we look hard at the violence itself, the picture shifts further still. This is where the careful work of historians has most sharply challenged the legend, and where we must follow the evidence even when it disappoints our expectations. There is a persistent popular claim that early Deadwood suffered something like a murder a day, and it appears in many colourful tellings of the town's story. But when historians have actually examined the records, the figure collapses. One careful study concluded that literally lawless Deadwood, in its notorious first year, saw only about 4 killings. Not 400, not one a day, but 4 in the whole of that famous first year. 4 killings is 4 too many, and it does not make the town gentle, but it is a very long way from the ceaseless slaughter of the legend.
This fits a broader pattern that historians have found across the whole mythologized West. When scholars examined the famous Kansas cattle towns, Dodge City and Abilene and the rest, places whose names are bywords for frontier violence, they found that across many years and several towns, the total number of killings was modest, averaging only a handful per town in a given year, and that many of these towns had strict ordinances requiring visitors to surrender their firearms upon entering. Even Tombstone, home of the most famous gunfight of all, saw only a small number of killings in its worst year, several of them in that single celebrated confrontation. The reality of frontier violence was real but intermittent, a matter of occasional deadly flare-ups rather than constant gunplay, and the towns were often far more concerned with controlling weapons than the legends would ever suggest.
We should be honest, too, about the difficulty of comparison. Some historians who study these questions with statistics point out that the small populations of frontier towns can make their violence look either very high or very low, depending on how the numbers are handled, and that a few killings in a town of a few thousand can produce a rate that seems alarming when measured against a modern city. So the raw counts and the calculated rates can tell somewhat different stories, and the careful historian holds both in mind without forcing a single tidy conclusion. What the evidence does not support in any case is the image of a town where gunfights filled every street and no order existed at all.
So where does this leave our central question? Let us separate what we can say with confidence from what we cannot. What we know is that Deadwood was an unusually fast-growing settlement that began outside the law, on treaty land, without formal government, and that for a short time its order rested on improvised and legally hollow institutions. What is probable is that his reputation for danger grew from real conditions, from genuine violence and vice and disorder in those early years. What became exaggerated, stretched far beyond the evidence, is the image of ceaseless gunfights and total anarchy, an image built by writers and filmmakers who preferred drama to truth. And what remains genuinely difficult to establish, perhaps impossible, is whether Deadwood deserves the literal title of the most lawless town in America, because the honest comparison with other towns resists a clean answer, and the very phrase most lawless dissolves the more closely you examine it. Lawless in what sense, and measured how, and against whom?
Perhaps the most useful answer is not a ranking at all, but a recognition. Deadwood was not uniquely lawless. It was for a brief and vivid moment genuinely lawless in a specific and unusual way, an illegal town on forbidden ground, and then it stopped being so with remarkable speed. Its true distinction lies not in the depth of its wickedness, but in the power of its legend, in the way a short and complicated chapter of frontier history was seized upon and magnified into one of the defining myths of the American West. Now that we have weighed the evidence and set the legend beside the record, let us do one last thing before the night carries us off. Let us go back, gently and without any hurry, and simply walk through the town one more time, not to gather facts, but to feel the place, to let it settle in the imagination the way a real town settles into the memory of anyone who has lived there. For the truest way to understand Deadwood is not to argue about it, but to stand quietly within it and watch an ordinary day move through the gulch.
Come with me then to the narrow valley in the years when the rush had cooled a little and the town had begun to find its rhythm. The morning comes late to Deadwood Gulch, for the walls of the valley are steep, and the sun must climb high before its light reaches the bottom, and so the day begins in a soft blue shadow, cool and still, with mist lying along the creek. The first sounds are the small domestic ones, the clink of a stove being lit, the creak of a door, the low murmur of voices, a rooster somewhere up the slope. Smoke begins to rise from the chimneys, thin grey threads climbing into the brightening sky, carrying the smell of wood smoke and coffee and frying bacon out over the sleeping street. A dog trots along the boardwalk. A shopkeeper unlocks his door and begins to sweep the step. The town is waking, slowly, into another day of ordinary work.
As the light strengthens and slides down the valley wall, the street fills. The freighters are moving already, their long teams leaning into the harness, hauling the heavy wagons up the grade with a great creaking and jangling and the shouts of the drivers. The blacksmith's fire is lit, and the ring of hammer on anvil begins its steady music, carrying clear in the morning air. Doors open all along the street, and the day's commerce spills out, the merchants arranging their goods, the bakers setting out their bread still warm, the assayer bending over his scales, the clerk at the bank counting out the coin. Children appear, picking their way along the muddy edges of the street, off to school or to some errand, or to the endless games of childhood that go on in every town, in every age. This is the Deadwood the legends never show you, and it is the truest Deadwood of all, a place of people simply living, working, hoping, getting through the day. Follow the street down toward the lower end, and the character shifts as it always did. Here the buildings crowd closer, and even in daylight there is a different feeling, a sense of a world that keeps different hours. The saloons are quiet now, their tables empty, their long nights not yet begun, but you can feel the promise of the evening in them, the way an empty theatre holds the memory of the show. And here, at the far northern end, is the quarter that the town called Chinatown, where the signs and the smells and the sounds are different, where Phi Li Wong's emporium displays its silks and its porcelain and its bundles of dried herbs, where the laundries send up their steam and the restaurants ready themselves for the day. A community within a community, keeping its own ways, weaving its own thread into the life of the whole. Pause here a moment
and remember how nearly this place was erased from the story, and how much poorer the story would be without it.
Now let the day turn, and watch the light climb back up the eastern wall of the gulch as afternoon fades toward evening. The freighters have made their deliveries, the shops begin to close, the working day winds down. And as the shadows pool again in the valley, the other Deadwood wakes. Lamps are lit behind the windows of the saloons, and their glow spills yellow onto the darkening street. Music starts up, a piano somewhere, a fiddle, the sound of voices and laughter rising, as the men who have spent the day at labor gather to spend the evening at play. The tables fill, the cards are dealt, the whiskey is poured. For a few hours the town belongs to the night, to the gamblers and the entertainers, and the restless energy of men far from home, with money in their pockets and little else to do with it. It could be a dangerous world, this nighttime town, and now and then it turned deadly. But mostly it was simply loud and bright and alive, a release at the end of a hard day in a hard place. And by the small hours it too would quiet, and the lamps would go out one by one, and the gulch would sink back into the deep silence of the hills.
And over all of it, through every season, the hills themselves stood watch. Think of the year turning over the gulch. In the spring, the snow melt swelled the creek and turned the street to mud, and set the whole town to the anxious work of digging and building and repairing. In the summer, the valley was busy and bright, the days long, the roads open, the wagons rolling, the town at the full flood of its life. In the autumn came the golden light and the first cold nights, and the smell of wood smoke thickened as everyone laid in fuel and supplies against the coming cold. And in the winter the gulch was gripped hard, the creek frozen, the roads difficult or closed, the town drawn in upon itself, the smoke rising straight up into the still and frigid air, everyone waiting through the long dark months for the return of the light. Year after year the cycle turned, and slowly, without anyone quite marking the moment, the temporary camp became a permanent town, and the permanent town grew old, and the rush that had made it passed into memory, and then into legend. The gold that had drawn everyone to the gulch did not last forever in the easy stream beds, and the lone prospector faded from the hills, replaced by the great company mine over in Lead, whose deep shafts and thundering mills would carry the region's fortunes for 100 years. And there is a place above the town where nearly all these threads come quietly together. On the steep slope overlooking Deadwood lies the cemetery called Mount Moriah, reached by a winding climb, and from its terraces you can look down over the whole narrow gulch where the town has always huddled along its creek. It is a peaceful place, shaded and still, and it holds within it a remarkable gathering of the people whose names this story has followed. Here lies Wild Bill Hickok, and here at her own request lies Calamity Jane beside him, the two of them together in death as they never truly were in life. Here too in time came Seth Bullock, the merchant and sheriff who helped guide the town toward order, and Preacher Smith, the gentle minister murdered on the Crook City Road, and Dora Dufran, the madam, and a great many others, the famous and the forgotten, the respectable and the disreputable, prospectors and merchants and children, all of them resting at last on the same quiet hillside above the town they had made.
In the earliest days, the dead had been buried lower down, in a graveyard that filled so quickly that many were later moved up the mountain, and some, unmarked and unremembered, were never moved at all, so that even now the earth of Deadwood occasionally gives up an old and nameless bone. To stand among the graves of Mount Moriah and look down at the roofs of the town is to feel more than anywhere else the passage of all that noise and hope and struggle into silence, and to sense how a raucous gold camp becomes in the fullness of years simply a place where people lived and died and were laid to rest.
The famous names of the wild years passed on, one by one. Hickok lay in his grave above the town almost from the beginning. Calamity Jane, after a hard and wandering life, came at last to rest beside him. Bullock lived on into a new century, a respected old pioneer, a friend of a president, watching the rough camp he had helped to tame become a quiet mountain town. Swearingen drifted away to a lonely and uncertain death far from the gem's bright and terrible nights. The people of Chinatown, pressed by prejudice and drawn by the decline of the mines, gradually departed, until only fragments in the earth remained to mark that they had ever been there at all. And the Lakota, from whom the hills had been taken, never stopped remembering that Pahasapa was theirs, and never stopped seeking its return, so that the oldest wound in the whole story stayed open, and stays open still. So there are, in the end, 3 Deadwoods, and it is worth holding all 3 in your mind as the fire burns low. There is the real town, the true place of mud and timber and brick, of miners and merchants and immigrants and families, of hard work and disease and occasional violence and swiftly arriving order, a place far more ordinary and far more human than its reputation. There is the remembered town, the Deadwood of the newspapers and the memoirs and the pioneer recollections, already shaped by the tellers toward the dramatic and the memorable, already beginning to blur fact into story. And there is the imagined town, the Deadwood of the dime novels and the films and the television dramas, the town of ceaseless gunfights and painted characters, the town that most of the world now carries in its mind, magnificent and vivid and largely untrue. The strange fate of Deadwood is that the third of these has nearly swallowed the first, so that a real and complicated human community has been almost wholly replaced in the memory of the world by a legend of its own most violent summer.
And yet the real town is still there if you know how to look for it, beneath the legend and beneath the modern streets. It is there in the brick buildings raised after the Great Fire, in the old cemetery on the hill, in the fragments of Chinatown buried in the earth, in the deep shaft of the old mine, in the records and the photographs and the patient work of the historians who keep trying to tell the truer story. It is there whenever someone chooses to remember the merchant as well as the gunfighter, the laundry worker as well as the gambler, the Lakota as well as the miner, the ordinary as well as the dramatic. The legend will always be louder, but the truth, quieter and more complicated, and in its own way more moving, is still waiting for anyone willing to sit with it a while.
Perhaps that is the real lesson of this small town in its narrow gulch of dead trees. Not that the West was wild, though for a moment here and there it was, but that the stories we tell about the past have a power all their own, a power to compress and select and exaggerate, to lift a few names into immortality and let thousands fall into forgetting,
to turn a difficult and human place into a myth as durable as stone. Deadwood should never officially have existed. It was born in trespass and legitimized by dispossession. It flared into vivid and improvised life, and it settled with astonishing speed into an ordinary town. And out of that brief and complicated reality, the world built one of its favorite dreams of the frontier. The dream is beautiful in its way, and terrible in its way, and it is not the truth. The truth lies quietly beneath it, in the gulch, in the earth, in the long memory of the hills.
And perhaps that is why the story still holds us all these years later. Not because of the gunfighters, though they are vivid, and not because of the legend, though it is grand, but because underneath it all lies something quieter and more true. The ordinary courage of people trying to build lives in a hard and beautiful place, and the deeper sorrow of a sacred land taken from those who loved it first. Hold both of those things gently as the fire burns down, the legend and the truth, the gold and the grief, the town that was never meant to exist, and the hills that were always meant to be exactly where they are.
The tents and the shanties are gone now. The men and women who rushed up the gulch in that centennial summer are long dead. The gold in the easy streams was gathered up and carried away more than a century ago. But the names remain, and the questions remain, and the hills remain, dark and wooded and enduring, holding their old meaning for the people who never stopped calling them sacred. And that, in the end, is the story of Deadwood. A story of gold and of migration and of dispossession and of ambition and commerce and disaster and myth-making. The story of a town that moved in the space of a few short years from the very edge of anarchy toward the ordinary business of civic life, and then, in memory, moved the other way, back toward a wildness it had only briefly and imperfectly known.
Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, and for walking so slowly and so patiently through the gulch of the dead trees, from the quiet hills before the rush to the long shadow of the legend. I hope the journey was a peaceful one, and that somewhere along the way the cares of your own day grew a little lighter and the world grew a little softer around you. If you found some rest or some wonder in this quiet history, it would mean a great deal if you left a gentle like before you go, for it truly helps these calm journeys find the others who are looking for them. And if you would like to keep travelling through the past in this unhurried way, consider subscribing, because this channel is still very new and still very small, and every single subscriber genuinely matters, helping something quiet and carefully made take root and grow. To be among the first to follow along is to help build this place from its very beginning, and that means more than I can easily say. Rest well tonight, wherever you are, and when you are ready for another calm and immersive journey through history, I will be here, with the fire lit and another story waiting. Until then, sleep peacefully, and let the hills keep their quiet watch over the past.